Welcome to Let's Hear It.
Let's Hear It is a podcast for and about the field of foundation and nonprofit communications, produced by its two co-hosts, Eric Brown and Kirk Brown. No relation.
Well said, Eric. And I'm Kirk.
And I'm Eric.
The podcast is sponsored by the Communications Network and the Lumina Foundation.
We're talking to people about their work and what's happening in the field with the hopes of making this growing arena just a little bit more accessible to us all.
You can find Let's Hear It on any podcast subscription platform. You can find us on Twitter at Let's Hear It Cast, and you can email us at hello@letshearitcast.com.
Let us know if you have any thoughts about what you hear today, including people we should have on the show.
And if you like the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts so that more people can find us.
So let's get on to the show. Welcome to Let's Hear It. In this week's show, we have a really special treat. Joy Harjo, the first Indigenous Poet Laureate of the United States. Joy is in conversation with Rebecca Arno, the Chief Operating Officer of the Barton Insitute for Community Action at the University of Denver, in a session recorded as part of ComnetV, the virtual gathering of the Communications Network, which was held earlier this year. Joy is the author of 9 books of poetry, including her most recent, An American Sunrise. Her memoir, Crazy Brave, was awarded the PEN USA Literary Award in Creative Nonfiction and the American Book Award. She is executive editor of the anthology When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry released in August of 2020. This conversation was part of ComnetV, as I said, the virtual gathering of the Communications Network, which was held in October. And we've been lucky enough to be able to broadcast some of these conversations on Let's Hear It. And I just think that this one is really special. Joy Harjo has a perspective and a deep connection with the world around her that is truly remarkable. She is a poet, a musician, and a dancer. And I also have to have a special shout out to my old pal, Rebecca Arno, who clearly gets Joy and so connects with her interviewee. It's a wonderful listen. And because this interview goes pretty long, Kirk and I we will withhold our commentary this time, but we will be back soon with regularly scheduled programming. Enjoy.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Arno. I am with the Barton Insitute for Community Action in Denver, Colorado. And I'm a longtime member of the network. I'm a former chair of the network board. And I am absolutely thrilled to be here today to speak with Joy Harjo. I'll introduce her in a moment and we'll get to hear from her. But before we begin our conversation, I would like to acknowledge that those of us in the United States and Canada are currently on lands that were stolen from Indigenous people, and that we need to recognize this and honor this history. In Denver, I am currently on lands that belonged to the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne tribes, and over 200 different tribes now live in the state of Colorado. So I encourage you to find out what land you might be, whose land you might be on at this moment. So here we are. Joy Harjo is the first Native American to be appointed as United States Poet Laureate. She's an internationally known activist, writer, musician, and a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. Joy, we are so honored to have you with us today.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to just start with a big question that I'm guessing you hear pretty frequently as the Poet Laureate of the United States. We are in such difficult times right now. We have a pandemic. We are finally, well, maybe not finally, at any rate, we are attempting to reckon with some incredible injustice that has happened over the course of U.S. history in terms of race relations. And many now are finding that poetry is like medicine to them. At least I am finding that. And I'm wondering what you think the role of poetry is in times like these.
Well, the role of, poetry is an oral art, and it's it's something I think that only humans do, and it has particular purpose, and a poem can hold almost anything. I have found poem can hold time, can hold different kinds of time. A poem can hold grief that is unbearable. It can hold joy that can also be almost unbearable. A poem can hold history, even pieces of history, shards of history, something that's been broken apart and needs to be put back together. And we come to poetry at those times of transformation in our lives, like birth, a huge moment of transformation, coming from one world to another in a very vulnerable and sacred moment. And we come to poetry during married, falling in love, falling out of love. There's a lot of poems and songs for that. And for marriage, for passing from this world, for praise, for poetry can hold what we cannot hold with words.
I was thinking that at this beginning of our conversation, I would love for the folks in the audience who haven't known your poetry to ask you to share a poem that is one of my favorites, and it's called "Once the World Was Perfect." Would you be willing to do that?
Yes, I will. I'll read that poem, and this poem is loosely based on a Muskogee Creek origin story about emerging up from probably another world that we humans destroyed, but we're emerging from the dark, and so it assures me we will emerge from this place. This wounding, we have a lot of work to do here. But there we were in the dark. So in our tribal nation, we have a lot of clans. We're related. Like I'm related to it's called the Tiger Clan, but it's the Big Cat Clan. So I'm related to them and the Wind Clan. And the Wind Clan people were the first, they said, that came through the opening, and then the others followed. And so this is called "Once the World Was Perfect." Probably that origin story happened around a time very much like this. Once the world was perfect, and we were happy in that world. Then we took it for granted. Discontent began a small rumble in the earthly mind. Then doubt pushed through with its spiked head. And once doubt ruptured the web, all manner of demon thoughts jumped through. We destroyed the world we had been given for inspiration for life. Each stone of jealousy, each stone of fear, greed, envy, and hatred put out the light. No one was without a stone in his or her hand. There we were, right back where we had started. We were bumping into each other in the dark, and now we had no place to live because we didn't know how to live with each other. Then one of the stumbling ones took pity on another and shared a blanket. The spark of kindness made a light. The light made an opening in the darkness. Everyone worked together to make a ladder. A Wind Clan person climbed out first into the next world, and then the other clans, the children of those clans, their children, their children, their children, their children, all the way through time to now. To you.
Thank you so much. That poem brings to mind how much of your work seems to expand in time, to deal with generations upon generations, while also being very grounded in the here and now. Do you think about time when you start working with a poem or the idea of a poem? How do you think about time? How do you work with time?
I think what dreams and then what poetry has taught me, one of your, I would say, tools, but it's also one of your materials when writing poetry is time. I mean, certainly you deal like a musician, with phrasing and timing. There is that element, but there's also, I think in the best poems, there's always a sense of eternity or timelessness. Mm-hmm. As well as the hardcore earth, blanket all this physicality of the world in which we are living, the physical, material world in which we're living.
Another of my favorite poems of yours that really brings that to light, the idea of the physical world holding eternity, is the poem, Perhaps the World Ends Here. And I know we just heard a poem, but can we hear another one?
That's cool. I'll just read if you want me to.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah, this one, often I have stories, well, the poem began with this or that, but this one, I don't remember how it began. I just followed it. And I think a lot of people have the conception that, poets just, they're inspired or they do crazy things to get inspired and then they write about it, but it's not always like that. So that maybe there's a little of that, but mostly it's, for me, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm following that voice. Sometimes it's a voice of the ancestors. Sometimes it could be a plant or something else, or even a memory from an ancestor that lives in my bones or somewhere. Or I'm watching a grandchild or something. I follow something. It could be a movement. It could be, I work a lot with rhythm. It could be a rhythm that I'm following. So this one, I just remember following it. And then here it is. And then I think, well, thank you. Doesn't mean it was done. Once I got the first draft, I go back and revise. And it's like you watch somebody sculpting wood or stone. Poetry is like that too. So then it's there. The spirit of it is set into place, and then I make a good place for it to live. Perhaps the world ends here. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table, we gossip. We call enemies and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us and at our poor, falling down selves as we put ourselves back together once again at the kitchen table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite.
So beautiful. Thank you so much.
I think of the world as a kitchen table, and that we're all really at the kitchen table university. So much we learn at that sort of the family origin place, that goes on at the center, or the fire at the center of the house, the fire in the stove, the stove, that's the center, that's the fire there.
So you mentioned this a moment ago about the oral tradition of your people and how that has influenced you. Mm-hmm. And the written word has really been a more recent phenomenon in the storytelling tradition of your people. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how you work with the oral tradition and the written tradition together, because I very much hear in your work the rhythms and the musicality that you've talked about. And I'm wondering if you read aloud to yourself as you're writing, or if you can talk about that interplay of the oral and written.
Yes, in fact, well, right now I'm in the last revision of my new memoir that will be out next September, that I've written during the pandemic, called Poet Warrior, A Call for Love and Justice. And so the last revisions of it, I read it aloud to someone else. I've learned there's 3 different levels of reading aloud. There's one where you just read aloud to yourself. And I always tell anyone writing, whether it's a paper, anything, read it aloud, because then you'll catch. It's all about listening. And then the next level is reading to someone else. And the third one, which is a little more tricky, or you find you have to be willing to be humiliated and shamed, is to read something new aloud to the public. There you catch everything, that needs to be changed or shifted. But yes, I think most of the literature in the world is oral. Yeah. If you think about it, written literature historically has been available only to a few. And some of our biggest epic texts are not in English language. And some things aren't meant to be in English language. They belong in a certain place and time. But I think I've been, as a musician, and then I was thinking about it and writing about it in my memoirs. I was going through and revising as I listened, is that when I went to Indian boarding school in the late 60s, it wasn't the usual Indian boarding school. It was an experiment. We're in Indian, I'm calling Indian, that's what we call ourselves, in Indian education, that instead of the usual, we still had the military system in place, but we also had the best native artists teaching us. And I didn't take poetry then. I didn't take writing. I was drawing. And then because I said I will never get on a stage, I wound up performing and being part of one of the first all-native drama and dance troupes. But as I was thinking about it the other day, it's that we were the generation, we were still fresh from oral cultures. We didn't have, when I was growing up, there was a point where we got a television. Not everybody had, there was a point for that. I guess people were listening to radio, and there was a lot of people talking to each other. That was the central, storytelling. It was in person. I still like that a lot. I still like that. My memoir opens with sitting with the old ones I call, and now years later, I'm sitting just like my aunt and then my cousin's father. We're sitting talking about the same things years later. There's that. But I remember thinking as I was writing that we were still close to those cultures. So yes, we had some brilliant storytellers and poets, but when it came to the English classes, what relationship did we have to a fourth grade reader that we were given to read, because it was assumed we couldn't read very well, about a banker. It's like, yeah. Our arts classes were excellent. We had some of the best arts teachers, but I was thinking about how close we were and how because of colonization, some of that has been disturbed, but it's there. It's always there. It has been there. It will be there after all of this is gone.
That's a very hopeful statement. And you performers and poets and musicians are the ones who carry that forward for us. So that no matter what happens in the tumult of society, we have that to carry forward, which is quite beautiful.
Yeah, the arts carry the spirit of our peoples. Mm-hmm. That's, the arts are, that's part of their role. They inspire us and they take us into the future, so to speak, and that's how we know who we are, by looking back on what we created and what we imagined and what was being imagined through us as intermediaries of sorts, or as we serve that. I think we're all in service. It's not just so-called service people, but all of us are in service.
Earlier, can you share again the name of your new memoir?
Poet Warrior, A Call for Love and Justice.
So in that, I hear that the poet is not a reflector. A poet is a warrior. A poet is an actor. And a poet has a role in bringing forth a just society. And I'm wondering if you could talk with our audience who are around the world, all interested in using words for social good, about how you see yourself as a poet, as a social justice warrior?
First of all, I like the title. I didn't come up with it. My editor did. I was going to call it For Justice for Love. That's how I used to always sign things. But after reading it, there's the character. She said I've totally reimagined memoir, but there's a poet voice. And there's a coming of age ceremony that happens in the book that surprised me. And she goes from being given a name, girl warrior, to becoming poet warrior. But I came to writing poetry. People weren't poets where I grew up. My mother cooked and cleaned. My father came from oil money, Indian oil money and my grandmother and my aunt were painters, and they were tribal leaders and speakers. And my mother's people were musicians, musicians and poets, and had no money. So I didn't know I was going to be a poet, that I was going to be a painter. I was not a speaker. I did not have a way with words. I still don't feel like I do necessarily. I've been with practice and with a lot of patience by my spiritual teachers, here and there. I started writing poetry as a student involved in Native rights movements in New Mexico as part of the Kiva Club, which was it started out as it was instituted as a social club, but it became in the very early 70s a club too. We looked around our community, these are our communities, not just the university community. And how can you stand by when you see racial prejudice and you see your people, being hurt, and you see this? We had to. We made, we went to work, and that's how my poetry. I don't think there was a point. I know what broke it open for me was to realize there were Native poets. I've later learned, yes, we did have Native poets. They were not in our textbooks, but I was around. I wound up I was in Albuquerque, where the school was, University of New Mexico. There were poets, I got to be there with Leslie Silko, major Laguna Pueblo novelist, poet, Simon Ortiz, Acoma poet, Jim Welch, I knew about him, from up in Montana, Blackfeet poet. And I was around, it was a time of the beginning of the multicultural literary movements, and with Ishmael Reed taking us all into a circle, and Jane Cortez became a major influence with her poetry. So I learned that through that the power, we can't all come, Indigenous peoples, we come from a place that we know words have power. And so the poetry just took hold of me. I did not expect it. In fact, I was pretty reluctant. I love painting. I didn't have to talk to anybody. Yeah. And, I was painting in a socially justice way. I wanted to paint warriors, but warriors as people whose names you would never know, like a woman who would get up early before dawn and cook and make lunches for everybody, and then go to work, go to school, and do her part, but no one might know her name.
Well, you have brought those voices to many of us, and let's talk a little bit about how you're also bringing the voices of those other Native poets that you discovered and the Native artists you've discovered to the world. Now, can you talk both about the anthology that you've edited, and then also about the project you have coming up? Yes,
I approached Norton about there's never been a comprehensive Norton anthology of Native literature. And I was told, well, it would be too expensive to do a literature because of permissions fees, but we would love a book of poetry, an anthology of poetry. So I looked around. I was teaching at that point at a school. I'm on my own now, and a wonderful University of Tennessee. I looked around and I thought, what resources do I have? I'm so busy. I'm working on I'm working on all these projects, and I'm teaching my students. So they were the first people I pulled into and started teaching classes in how do you put together a Norton anthology and in Native literature. So they were learning, and we had all kinds of speakers and permissions editors, all kinds, so they could see how the whole process worked. And then I pulled together the experts. They were all Native poets. So the anthology, I am not the only editor. I am one of many, many editors. There was the core group is Leanne Howe, Choctaw writer, playwright, thinker, philosopher extraordinaire. Jennifer Elise Forrester, who when Muskogee Creek, who as a child knew about my poetry and came up being a poet. And then we divided the anthology. It's a comprehensive anthology of Native Nations poetry from time immemorial to the present. So we have 6 geographical areas. We didn't want to go by political borders and rather geographical areas. So we have 6 geographical areas and contributing editors and regional advisors and everyone. So all of us had a part, and it's the first time this has happened. I can't believe all this time, this is the first time we have a comprehensive anthology called When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry. And yes, the title is long, that's my fault. But I think an anthology of like that of that size, it needs a title. An anthology like that needs a title like that. And first we only had a few pages. We said, well, the Norton textbook people said, well, people don't read anymore. Their attention spans have shrunk with texting. So we're not making the anthologies as large. So you can only have 300 pages. And I said, wait a minute, we have over 540 federally recognized tribal groups, and that's not everybody. So they upped the page. It came out to 4-something pages, a little over 400 pages.
It's a wonderful, incredible document that you've pulled together, and now you're taking it online. So what is the next step?
That's a second anthology. Yeah, it says Poet Laureate. You have a project, and my term was renewed. So I wanted to do ultimately a world map of Indigenous poetry. And they said, wait a minute, we have, there's capacity. You have to think about capacity. How much, so there's a small staff at the wonderful staff at the Poetry and Literature Center led by Rob Casper. And when I went to work with this position, I said, Library of Congress, it's the biggest public library in the world, and people anywhere in the world can join, can get a library card. And I said, I want to see what's here. I've always wanted to know my way in here. So I met with all these departments, and I love geography and maps. So this project I came up with, is the idea of a digital story map that would be available to anyone that would show the earth with no political boundaries, the land, and place Native poets. We had to go with contemporary Native poets, and we only have about 50 because we have to do capacity. And it shows where they live, and there'll be pop-ups where they read their poetry. They'll read a poem, talk about place. And that Norton decided to do a text for that called Living Nations, Living Words. So that will be up and running, I think that by May, and everyone will be able to access it. But it was important as Poet Laureate and as a human being and as an American citizen to say, what are the roots of literature in this country? They do go back to Indigenous nations. Mm-hmm. They do go back. We have tremendous traditions of poetry. So that's a start. But then I wanted to show how everybody was influenced by whom. We all have ancestors. We have physical ancestors or familial, but we also have like poetry ancestors or ancestors of social rights organizations, corporate, there's ancestors. And so once you start looking at those lines of influence, I was telling the staff, I would like to link to every poet in this country. And it's like, we can't do that. We don't have enough staff. But it's really cool because couldn't you imagine a network between all of these dots on this map that is without these political boundaries, which cause so much trouble and are really they're not real. They're kind of, most of them are made of false narratives anyway.
So who are your dots? Who would you link to?
Okay, immediately I think of Louis Armstrong, but that's music. I know, and let's see. I would link to Simon Ortiz, to Leslie Silko, as I mentioned. I would have to have a link to Toni Morrison, too. Even though she was a novelist, she was also, I think she was a poet novelist, even though she wouldn't call herself a poet. Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich, Yeats. There's someone else I've been pulling up. I had to do a little video on small presses, and Kofi, one of the books I carried around with me for a long time was a Ghanaian poet, Kofi Awanor. And it was a little chapbook he did called Ride Me Memory. Because when I first started writing as an Indigenous poet of the Americas, I thought, but who in the world is writing poetry from Indigenous, with an Indigenous root? So I went to Africa, and it was very inspired by poets there and writers, Amos Tutuola, the palm wine drinker. And then my links would just go all over the world. I mean, one of my favorite poets is Ali Kobe Erkeman. She's Australian Aboriginal poet. Because like with the arts, we generally, I think the arts move outside political boundaries. We speak across those kinds of boundaries.
You're listening to Let's Hear It, a podcast about foundation and nonprofit communications hosted by Kirk Brown and Eric Brown. Let's Hear It is sponsored by the Communications Network, which connects, gathers, and informs the field of leaders working in communications for good. Because foundations and nonprofits that communicate well are stronger, smarter, and vastly more effective. You can find Let's Hear It online at letshearitcast.com or on Twitter at Let's Hear It Cast. Thanks for listening, and now back to the show.
I'd like to, you've mentioned a couple of times about your musical interests, and I know that you took up the saxophone in your 40s, I believe. Can you talk about how music operates within your life, how you came to be a musician later in life, and how music both is similar to poetry, but also different from poetry?
I always loved music, always. I'm more of a dancer. People don't know that. I dance almost every day, different. And my mother, I grew up hearing music. My mother was a singer and wrote songs. And I remember I loved the Underwood typewriter that sat on our kitchen table. When she was writing, not always, it was usually food. She always did a lot of cooking. So I love music. That's how I came to poetry. She loved poetry too. Like, I think of it as talk singing. And she loved that. So she imparted that love, and she was my parents are both great dancers. So she imparted that love to me. So when I was in, I think, 5th grade, I got a clarinet, and I didn't have any lessons. Once a week, somebody would come and get our little band together, and we would have to play through these exercises. And in 6th grade, then I went to junior high, and I remember I was in the junior high band the first year, and the band teacher said he wanted someone to play saxophone, and I wanted to play, he wouldn't let girls play. So I got mad. And around the same time, my stepfather caught me singing in my room and said, there will be no more singing in this house. Because my mother would sing too, but as soon as we knew his car was coming up, we would stop. The whole house would go silent. So when he caught me, I didn't hear him drive up. I just walked away from music. So it was poetry came to me. And of course, poetry always comes with music on one arm and dance on the other. So there they came. And I was actually living in Denver, and I picked up it was 1990, 91, about 91. I was 40. I turned 40 in 91, I think, is that I started playing saxophone. And people who had known me as a poet would come and say, you can't do this. What you're going to, one of my biggest fans, and she's been there all along, and my Italian translator says, why are you distracting yourself? But they did that when I wanted to be a poet, I said, you can't be a poet, you will starve. That sound, because I could sing with a horn like Aretha Franklin. And then I just play out with whomever. I play out with I always get the best musicians because I learn that way. I get musicians better than me. And so it's developed. I'm working on a new album right now called This Morning I Pray for My Enemies. And it's just like, to me, this is my dream album. I'm working with a producer, Barrett Martin. But, I've never seen poetry, music, or dance very far away from each other.
This Morning I Pray for My Enemies brings to mind another poem of yours.
Yes.
I don't know if you have that one with you that you could read.
I do. This morning I pray for my enemies. And whom do I call my enemy? An enemy must be worthy of engagement. I turn in the direction of the sun and keep walking. It's the heart that asks the question, not my furious mind. The heart is the smaller cousin of the sun. It sees and knows everything. It hears the gnashing even as it hears the blessing. The door to the mind should only open from the heart. An enemy who gets in risks the danger of becoming a friend.
A piece like that draws us together and reminds us of what we share. I'm so grateful to you for that at this time when division feels so challenging. And in order to fight for justice, it seems like the people that we are trying to communicate with are the enemies. Certainly that poem does this, but can you talk about how you have thought about words, poetry, story as a way to reach across difference and into other cultures, into other ways of thinking?
I think that's what poets and artists do without thinking. I mean, I think that's inherent in the nature of poetry. I mean, thinking about that poem too, it's full of Muskogean cultural references, and at the same time, it's very human. We all know that, we all have that experience. And that's where we have to, ultimately land ultimately we have to land in compassion, or that's the point, or not, it's not even a point. It's more like a circle. I don't know. I think about it a lot, because I have another poem called No. No.
Will you share that with us?
I will, because there's a place in it where I think, where it says, and like a fool, I expected our words might rise up and jam the artillery in the hands of dictators. Mm. That was me. You saw shaking with bravery, with a government-issued rifle on my back. I could not greet you as you deserved, my relative. They were not my tears. I have a reservoir inside. They will be cried by my sons, my daughters, if I can't learn how to turn tears to stone. Yes, that was me, standing in the back door of the house of the alley with fresh corn and bread for the neighbors. I did not foresee the flood of blood, how they would forget our friendship, would return to kill the babies and me. Yes, that was me, whirling on the dance floor. We made such a racket with all that joy. I loved the whole world with that silly music. I did not realize the terrible dance and the staccato of bullets. Yes, I smelled the burning grease of corpses, and like a fool, I expected our words might rise up and jam the artillery in the hands of dictators. We had to keep going. We sang our grief to clean the air of turbulent spirits. Yes, I did see the terrible black clouds as I cooked dinner, and the messages of the dying spelled there in the ashy sunset. Everyone addressed Mother. There was nothing about it in the news. Everything was the same. Unemployment was up. Another queen crowned with flowers. Then there were the sports scores. Yes, the distance was great between your country and mine, yet our children played in the path between our houses. No, we had no quarrel with each other.
Beautiful. Thank you. So I feel like after each poem, I want to take a half an hour to sit with it and to absorb it and to think about the imagery and to let it go deep. And I'm wondering if you could talk about in this way and to jump right in with that advertising style language to grab people and get their attention. What is your recommendation to us as we think about using some of the tools of poetry to advance our missions in the organizations where we work?
Just something you were saying just now, and I was thinking about how, and I know about sound bites, and I know about my propensity to go against them naturally, even though I've learned to make sound bites, is that it's like anything that is meant to be quick. And it's in the nature of poetry. It's not just mine, but it's overall in the nature of poetry to create a resonance that goes past any kind of political rhetoric, that goes past any kind of, I was thinking too, and it's not just me. At Indian School, I learned a little bit of Apache, but at the University of New Mexico, I got permission to use Navajo as my foreign language. So I learned that. I used to speak Navajo pretty well. I can still understand a lot of it. I actually worked in a language photographing as a photographer. I actually worked in a Navajo language program for a while. I've done a lot of jobs. As a poet, you do a lot of jobs to make a living. I mean, I cleaned hospital rooms. I've done all kinds of things. So, but the thing everyone is saying, and then our Muskogee language people, is that the one thing you could go in and teach language in a classroom, but people in this contemporary world are losing a sense of metaphor. That the speakers, and I'm sure that's probably true in English too, with it texting, there's not a lot of room for metaphor in texting usually. You lose that. It's about speed, just like sound bites. It's about speed. It's about, this a heavy thrust of a lot of stuff to break through and to make a point or to make a resonant, a quick resonant point. But what about metaphor? Like proverbs. I was going to say proverbial. I wonder that must be connected. Proverbs, but those tasty things, those like the poet of Rumi that stay with you forever. What about metaphor and language?
I have to ask, do you consider hip hop to be poetry?
Some of it. Some of that comes out of very old, the roots of hip hop are very old. Very old roots that come out of it's they directly link to indigenous orality and the love for language and making of it. I'm saying not all of it, the best of it, and making perceptive observations on regarding social change or lack thereof, and the state of the state of the nation, so to speak, the best of it.
The audience that we're speaking with today are people who are charged with oftentimes listening to community and then translating the needs of the community to a broader world. And we're in foundations and nonprofit organizations are in every community, really around the world. And we're all trying to help birth a better world for our various communities. So what would you implore us to do? You now have an ability to share what you would implore the folks at foundations with lots of resources, at nonprofits who are working deeply in community. What is it that you would ask us to be on behalf of our communities?
Oh man, this is, I think about that a lot. I'm chair of the board for Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, which it was a dream. I mean, that organization, I saw it years and years and years ago. I didn't institute it. I'm one of the founding board members, so it all came about, but I saw that there was going to be this organization. And I think that we're all a community. I think what brings us all together is that what I guess connects everyone is that we're all working towards, it's about communication ultimately. It's about listening. I think that would be the first thing. I think that's the first thing for all of us. And when the poetry came to me, it said, "You poor thing, I don't know if we're going to take you on or not, because You don't know how to listen. And I'm not the best listener. I try and I keep trying. I think that's why the music, you have to listen. It's about, you have to listen. Poetry, you have to listen. And I think that that's too, maybe the central role of those, of the all of our organizations is about listening to what it is, one, what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it. We have to listen to the past, even as we're listening to the future. And pay attention too to the roots. You were talking, I'm glad that you did the land acknowledgement at the first. It becomes tricky when you're, everybody is everywhere, and it's like, wait a minute, we are the land. Ultimately, you come to realize that this land is my land. It's not your land. It's like, if you look at the earth from the context, all about context from that's why that NASA image, that suddenly there was ecological movement. Suddenly there was people talking about global, was when that image of earth was set free. So, yeah, so ultimately you have to listen and to be, to keep that in mind, that beautiful blue, green, compassionate planet with all the complexity, because the challenges are how we grow our spiritual and physical and muscle. I mean, that's the end result, and there's so much to be done. And all of us are going through right now, we're all going through such challenging times, but it's in these moments, and that's where we especially need everybody. We need everybody. It's at those moments that the best stories emerge. I've wondered what humans mean. I mean, and that's why I know we need poetry. What use are humans on this earth? I wonder that. If you think about it, this immense biosphere, and you see the trees doing their beautiful job, and you see that, everybody, you can see how everybody's doing their jobs, and what are humans? Here are these humans. How are they furthering this? Or are they stacking up trash or digging and destroying? Or I think you have to keep that in mind, and then realize that the children are all our children. That's what I was taught as a Muskogee Creek person, is that they're all our children. Doesn't matter your neighbors or another person of another culture. They're all of our children. We're here for all of them, the grandchildren, and that our relatives are also the plants. You have to start thinking and knowing that it's not just thinking it, that's the reality, and what is going to be helpful and what is going to forward, particularly in such an incredibly diverse world. Because you have this biosphere, but we have this incredible diversity. Well, I think, what do humans do? We write poem. We tell the story. We're story makers. I started thinking, well, what do humans do? We go out and we gather stories. Everybody does it. Whether it's smoke signals, or phone, or texting, or turning a TV on used to, or a radio, or firing up the computer, yelling at you across the fence at your neighbor. We collect stories, and we're part of maybe collecting the story of Earth and the story of each other, and helping the story along in a way that empowers, in all the ways that we work towards empowerment of our communities, of people, in our communities, the environment, the water, the land. But in all of it, it's important to remember that the original keepers of the lands are the indigenous peoples, and not to forget that. And we all have to face, that's what we're dealing with right now, is a struggle to deal with the hard parts of the story of America. But if as a healer, if there's a wound, there's a lot of things that need to happen. Often the wound needs to be cleaned out. Has to be cleaned out. And then the healer always gets the story. That's a really important part of it. How did this come to be? We need to hear all of it. It's not going to heal if we don't have all the parts of the story. And then it can be cleaned. It can be cleaned, and then after the healing, then we'll all have a party.
That is an incredible call to all of us to listen and to do the most human of things, which is to be a storyteller. I love that idea. I was reading the writer and thinker Richard Rohr the other day. He said something about what would it be if we found out that the animals were the ones who were really actually doing what they were supposed to do here, and humans were completely confused and hadn't found it yet. But maybe it's the storytelling that we've always done, and that sometimes seems to get marginalized as a way of connecting with each other. I'm interested, and this question has come in through the chat. Do you make poetry for other people, or do you make it for yourself? Is it a conversation with yourself, or is it a conversation with your ancestors or the world?
I think first I think the poetry was a way for the old ones to teach me. I was a wreck. Yeah. It's a way to, it's a way for them to get through to me, but it's a tool. I've learned that it teaches me, and I learned things long before they've been poems, not just to help me, but other people. At the same time, they're pieces of art, and I think that my original impulse really was as a healer, as my original impulse. And then I love language. I love music. I love playing music. And it's a way to kind of put everything together like that. Images, I like to paint. We'll put the images. It's a way to pull all of that together. And then it's something beyond me. It's not something I feel like I chose to do. It's like, okay, we need somebody to do this. And I'm sitting over there hiding out, trying to be the one they don't notice. And then there I get dragged. I used to have a horrible stage fright. And then I get dragged in, and I think, okay, I like this. I try to, okay. And then it just kept going, and I had to follow it. In my memoir, the new memoir, I have a passage about when I said no, when I told that deep inner spiritual circle that we all have. I call them the council. And I said no, and then what followed, I won't tell you. Yes.
Can't wait to read it.
Yeah, to read the book.
Well, I know that I've read Crazy Brave, which is your first memoir, and incredible work. I highly recommend it to everyone. The way that you bring poetry and song and history and then the story of your family together is just, it's gorgeous. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how your family story and you certainly do this in Crazy Brave, how that has carried you through to now you're a poet laureate, you're talking to people all over the world. And what's the connection between that little girl in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the woman who is out on the stages of the world?
Man, it's been quite a journey. I think if anything, I want it to inspire people, because I know there were times I gave up, or I write about it in Crazy Brave, where I was a teenage mother and we had nothing. I'd walk the streets, and then those old ones would be telling, what did you get into? Why didn't you listen? And I thought, how am I going to, I know I have a path, but how am I going to get there now? So this will be interesting, and they'll stand and watch us. They stand and watch us, I've learned, as we flounder and say, okay, sometimes it's several ancestors watching. Okay, what is she going to do here? It's just like in a story. We all have our stories. What's going to happen here? And then they'll think, oh, no. Oh, no, don't go that way. But, we would have no movies or anything if the character didn't. So maybe I was here to make a good story, a good story, but I wouldn't be here without my people, the ones, my father's family, and then my mother's family. And my father's family did not want him marrying her because she came from sharecroppers, was, really poor. They loved poetry and music. She was, a mix. There was part Chickasaw. Was a Chickasaw enrolled citizen. And then there was a Cherokee and Irish and French. And then my father's family from this very prominent, historically, in the tribe family. And they had money because of the oil. And it's like, no, but what's going to come out of this? This is contradictions. And as I said in Crazy Brave, she was fire and he was water. What does that make? Makes for steam and but that's what makes a good that's what makes a good poem or a good story is, okay, how do we solve these things? Like right now, we're going to start a pandemic in the world. You talk about global, then we're going to see what global is. You want to talk about democracy? Well, then we are going to have a little test here. We're going to test you and see what democracy is. You want to talk about diversity and equality? And we're going to have another test. And we're going to run these all at the same time. We're going to see what this is.
So that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think so. I think we just have a trickster God who's like, okay, the grand story maker. We're a whole council of story makers for this mess.
Well, that would explain a lot, I think. Another question that has come in, what is your favorite word and why?
I don't know that I have a favorite word. It's like asking who's your favorite child? Yeah. And why? They all have their characteristics. I know as I'm writing this that there are certain words that I'm saying, now what are they that I'm having to cut out? One of the words I'm going through and cutting out is haunted. I've had to cut. I'm thinking I've got too many haunteds in here. So I'm going through.
Why do you think that word is coming up for you so much?
Well, it's a memoir. I'm going back. And then there's another word I've always tried to cut is world. I use that way too much. There was a time when I was using the word beautiful all the time, but I'm a romantic. And so there's words that come up that I start overusing, and I'm aware of them. And I think, okay, well, you're coming up because you need my attention. So I talk to them, you're coming up, you need my attention. You're working way too hard. Why don't you sit over here for a little while?
Well, we're getting close to our time here. And I'm wondering if we could start by, or we could start our ending by asking you to share, if you could have each person leave this session and do just one thing, what would that be?
Maybe it's to sit with their spirit. Maybe you don't even know what your spirit looks like or what it sounds like or where it comes from or where it's going or where it's been. In my memoir, I was writing about how I was in a spin class. I just finished a spin class in West Hollywood. And I suddenly had this thought, and I saw it, a donut. I finished the spin class. But then, we get these thoughts, and we don't always think about them. And I thought, a donut. And I thought, no, wait a minute. That's not mine. It occurred to me that I wasn't going to go get a donut. It was somebody else's. So I followed that thought, and it was the guy next to me. And then it was so profound. It was like, oh my gosh, where do my thoughts come from? They're not all my thoughts. Some of them you can trace them to, ancestors. I've been through dreams that I know were experiences that my ancestors went through. I've traced them to plants. So I think it's important, and we don't do that enough. And even I get lost sometimes is to sit and you might want to write. Everybody can write and just think, where am I? Where's my spirit? Is it sitting? Is it hidden? Is it hiding in my shoulder? What is it? What is it telling me? Do I hear anything? What do I hear?
So yet again, the listening.
Yes.
Listening is the essential calling for all of us. As we think about communicating, it is time for us to listen. And it has been an incredible joy to listen to you, Joy. I'm sure people have done that before. It's just been wonderful to hear your thoughts and to hear your poetry. And if you have any final words for us, any final recommendations of poets or books, we'd love to hear them. But how would you like to close?
Well, I would say that the anthology of to hear the native voices of these lands here would be to pick up that anthology. None of the editors, we're not paying ourselves. All the money made from it will go to native poetry. And that way you can hear many voices, not just me carrying on here, because I'm not the only one. I'm just a doorway. There are many, many, many voices, native voices, voices of poetry everywhere. The poets are our truth tellers, the listeners. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed spending some time with you, and I wish I could see everyone too. But
thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here, Joy.
Okay.
Well, thanks for listening, folks. I hope you enjoyed that as much as we did. We will see you soon on Let's Hear It.
And that's it for this episode. Please let us know if you have any thoughts about what you heard today, or people we should have on the show, and that includes yourself. We'd like to thank
Maggie Brown, our intrepid production coordinator.
John Ali, the tuneful and inspiring composer of our theme music.
We'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Communications Network, the Lumina Foundation, and the Heinz Endowments.
Thank you. And check out the Heinz Endowment, their terrific podcast, We Can Be. That's hosted by Grant Oliphant, and you can find it at heinz.org/podcast.
We would certainly like to thank today's guest, and of course all of you, and thank you, Mr. Brown.
No, thank you, Mr. Brown.
Till next time.
Let's hear it.